Thank you very much. Welcome to the cybersecurity panel. So, first of all, let me introduce our great speakers today, and thank you very much for joining us. So, we have Alexandra Maniati, Senior Director of Innovation and Cybersecurity in the European Banking Federation. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the invitation.
We have Tom Clementi, Chief Executive Officer of PulRe. And we have Janet Jervis, our Chief Membership and Communications Officer for the Cyber Threat Alliance. Thank you very much. So the panel today, the title is Cooperation and Global Challenges. And actually, I cannot find a better definition of cybersecurity. So which is more collaboration and global threat that we have in cyber. So we have a very becoming more and more challenging threat landscape. So we are seeing much more sophisticated attacks, an increase of attacks. We are seeing how the geopolitical situation is impacting our cybersecurity environment. So by the other hand, we are seeing the cost the cybercrime is having to the society, estimated in 10.5 trillion in 2025, which is huge. So I think that public-private collaboration, but not only within the financial sector, but as well cross-industry, cross-sector, is required and actually is a need in order to deal with this global threat. So first of all, I want to do a round table to see what's your view on this never-ending battle. So Alexander, do you want to start?
Thanks, Hazel. Thank you. Well, it is a never-ending battle. You couldn't be more accurate when you talk cyber, and because it's a never-ending battle, it doesn't have a final winner or loser. So sometimes you win some, and sometimes you lose some. The thing is that, and what is worrying, that as always with crime, time's on the side of the criminals. So let's say the good guys in cybersecurity are only as good as their last success. So a successful IT migration, a timely patch of a major vulnerability without causing too much damage, a successful bouncing off of an attack. But then it only takes one vulnerability on a software that you have purchased or in a third critical or hopefully not critical third-party provider that you are using, and that's enough to do the damage. And that's why we can never be complacent. We need to stay vigilant. We need to always try to stay one step ahead of the criminals, and also to educate people, because usually, most of the times, it all starts with phishing. Phishing exploits fear, exploits worry. Attackers adapt to the circumstances. We've seen that with COVID and with the emails on information and vaccines. We've seen that with the Ukraine war and the emails with aid. So that's what they do. And that's why we need to educate people all the time, so to stay one step ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Very challenging environment. We always say that this is a total unbalanced situation, so it's much easier to attack than to defend, right? So it's a very complex environment. How do you see that, Tom?
I think if we characterize this somewhat crudely as a sort of zero-sum game between the good guys and the bad guys, I think very crudely the bad guys are probably winning, actually. But then the odds are stacked in their favor. It's not a level playing field, because they just have to be lucky once. They have to be right once. We have to be right every single time. And that's tricky when you've got 50,000 employees and it just takes one to click on a URL and suddenly they're inside your network. And I think ransomware is a real plague on Western institutions, and it's massively underreported. And these gangs are not really gangs in the sense that we would understand gangs. They're very sophisticated franchises with sort of a semblance of corporate governance and HR functions. And they're phenomenally profitable, so they're able to attract talent. People who are bad people, but they're very talented people. And I think breaking the business models of the ransomware gangs is going to be extremely challenging. I think you probably know, but something like 98-99% of ransoms are paid in digital currencies. Digital currencies aren't going away; they're going to be with us, I think, for the foreseeable. And it's quite hard to trace and track the ultimate beneficial owner of the assets when it's held digitally. And when they're off-ramped into cash, often it's in very weak jurisdictions. So I think there's probably an answer around international collaboration and regulation, but there are some countries where you're off-ramping the digital currencies that won't necessarily want to participate in that collaboration. So yeah, I mean, it's a challenge. I think the bad guys are probably winning for the time being. And then we haven't talked about hostile states, but they're also extremely sophisticated. And we've seen hostile states engage in cyber espionage, but also in more disruptive and destructive cyber attacks as well, particularly Russia and Ukraine, and also Iran in Israel. So it's not a particularly pretty, it's rather a bleak picture, I'm afraid.
Very complex environment, right? So Janet, do you want to share with us?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it is a complex environment, and sometimes I feel like we are losing. The bad guys do have an advantage, but that doesn't even make sense, right? There's more of us than there are the bad guys. We have fantastic technologies, but we are making a few mistakes. I would like to say, though, that not a day goes by that we don't hear about a breach, or we don't hear about a ransomware attack, or we don't hear about a new phishing tactic, or name your threat. And it's getting very frustrating. What I find is, I lost my thought. What I find is the bad guys are smart, and we know that, and they have a lot of more tools than us. But I think when you look at the entire threat landscape, most of us are not affected. It's likely not as bad as we think it is. I mean, it's bad, don't get me wrong, but most of my friends have never been attacked. I've been breached a few times, and I find it very frustrating. But overall, we have the brains, we have the technologies. We just need to be better at integrating the technologies so that we are able to discover the threats better. I want to comment on a breach that I heard recently that really troubles me, and that is the 23andMe. When you're breached, if your bank is breached, you commonly aren't impacted outside of having to change your password. Most of the time, money isn't taken. But 23andMe stores your DNA, and you can't change your DNA. And now, potentially, hackers have a chance to go after your heritage. And there's nothing you can do about your heritage. They may attack you specifically because you're a certain heritage. Those kind of attacks are disconcerting. I think that we need, as an industry, to do a better job of locking down the data and segregating the data so that this sort of attack just doesn't happen again. It's very scary. But I do want to say that we'll always have cybercrime. We're never going to get rid of it, right? Criminals are criminals. And, even in the real world, the non-cyber world, you still have crime no matter what you do. The problem is human nature. What can we do to stop the phishing, right? I get probably 4 or 5 voice phishing phone calls a week. To the extent now I don't even answer my phone unless I know the number. I probably get 5 or 6 texts a week. I think we can do a lot better with some of our technologies in stopping these before they get to the end user.
Yeah, I think that we all agree. So by one hand, the threat landscape is really challenging. So we recognize that we need to collaborate and to work together, because no organization, no single public government can deal with this threat in isolation. So cooperation is key. And on that regard, so Janet, I would like to know more about how you have become to and actually share in information sharing platform. So Cyber Threat Alliance is a real good example of collaboration of what we are natural competitors. So how you have get to achieve that collaboration?
Yeah, I'm really excited and proud of what we've done at the Cyber Threat Alliance. Cyber Threat Alliance is the prime example of how competitors can work together. Cyber Threat Alliance started when 2 CEOs of fierce competitors, Palo Alto Networks and Fortinet, came together and said to each other, why aren't we working better together? Why don't we start an organization and share data? They came to us. I was at McAfee at the time and helped lead the effort. McAfee signed on, as did Symantec. And, McAfee and Symantec are fierce competitors as well. And these are, when I say fierce, I mean, these are top-notch, leading the industry, fierce competitors. And they all decided to work together. And what they realized right away was they don't compete on the data. They compete on what they do with the data. It's their technologies that set them apart, not the data. And if we want to walk the talk about protecting the internet, which every cybersecurity vendor says, you need to share the data. You need to show people what you're seeing. We need to understand the tactics and techniques, procedures that these hackers are using so that we can warn other organizations. If a bank is getting attacked in Spain, certainly that tactic needs to be known because Brazil is probably next, right? The sooner we share the new tactics, the better protected everybody's going to be. And another thing the CTA does, which is highly unusual, is they share threat research, threat reports, white papers before they're made public. So this allows our CTA members to be prepared. So when it goes public and everything blows up because it might be some new threat or something significant, our members are already prepared. So I want to ask you all, you need to ask your cybersecurity vendors, are you a member of CTA? And if they're not, you need to ask why not, because this is, CTA is also a nonprofit. We turned it into a nonprofit in 2017, so it's independent, ran. We don't treat any one member better or worse than any other. We have 35 members headquartered in 12 countries, including Spain. Panda Security in Spain is a member. We're committed to changing the landscape by working together.
Yeah, I think that when we go to and we talk about collaboration, I think that one thing is key is trust. So actually to share information and share information in advance. So I think that it's a question of trust. So building this circle is, and this group is, I think that is actually the great success of CTA.
Yeah, it was established. You have to lead with trust, right? And so far, you know, we started in 2014. We turned it into a nonprofit in 2017. No one's ever broken the trust. The early share program is all TLP. You know, they everybody sticks to it. So far, you have to lead with trust. You know, we're all in this fight together.
So if we go to the regulatory space, so my favorite one. So I think that we are living a unique moment in Europe. So I haven't seen so many developments regarding to cybersecurity, operational resilience. So all of these new developments will bring challenges and opportunities. So how do you see this new change in Europe?
That's a great question, Hazel. I remember back in 2017 when I joined the EBF, there was probably nothing at the European legislation on cybersecurity, I think with the exception of the first Network and Information Systems Directive, the NIS. In the last 5 years, we have seen an amazing proliferation of legislative initiatives, not only on cybersecurity, but on all things digital. So I've made a note here. So we have seen 4 proposals on a data-driven economy, 3 proposals on payments, 1 proposal for the digital euro, the market in crypto assets regulation, the regulation for digital identity, the AI Act, and for cybersecurity and resilience, 4 proposals. DORA, the Digital Operation Resilience Act, the revision of the NIS Directive, so NIS 2, the Cyber Resilience Act, and the Cyber Solidarity Act. So I'm counting 15 legislative proposals, and these are only the highlights. Now, if I look at DORA, and of course with the caveat that we are now in the process of getting from the European Supervisory Authorities the 13 RTSs that are going to specify the requirements of DORA, and with the caveat that we get this right, in my view, DORA is what is good about regulation. So it marks a very welcome shift to what you were saying before, Jeanette, that crime will always exist, breaches will happen, incidents will happen. So we move the shift to resilience. Not so much, cybersecurity is always important, but we move this shift to resilience. Then there are requirements for the whole financial ecosystem. And then there is also for the first time an oversight for critical third-party providers that are outside of the financial services sector, but are critical for the operation of the sector. For me, that's a holistic approach that recognizes how important it is that everybody in the ecosystem plays their part and that banks cannot go at it alone. Everybody who connects with them needs to be responsible for their own cybersecurity and resilience. That's good. However, before the ink was dry on DORA, we got another proposal that is called the Cyber Resilience Act, the CRA. And although the introduction of cybersecurity requirements for digital products is positive, in our view, what is required there of banks in terms of the software and the applications that they develop internally is already foreseen by DORA. So if the banks are not exempted from the scope of the CRA, we will probably end up with requirements that are overlapping and duplicating. And these are two words that we don't like in regulation. We don't like overlaps, duplications, and we don't like fragmentation and gold plating and multiple reporting. So there are good initiatives in place, but also there is too much coming at once. We need to be a little bit more synergetic.
Yes, absolutely. So this is the good and not that good side of the regulation. So we need to make an effective regulatory development, actually. So we have talked about strengthening regulation, strengthening collaboration. So what the insurance sector industry can bring to the society and to this cybersecurity threat as a benefit.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm from the insurance industry, so it's a very boring industry, but we make banking look sexy. So you can thank us for that. I mean, cyber is a real worry for people in my industry, but we're having to deal with it because it's happening to our clients. And if we want to be relevant, you've got to make sure that you can provide services that your clients want. So I think we play an important role in fostering resilience. So it's not just what I would call the kind of straightforward risk transfer, where you buy a bit of insurance and you transfer a bit of risk from your balance sheet to someone else's. And if an event happens and you have a loss, then you get someone to pay you a claim. That's bog standard insurance 101. I think the cyber insurance market can do better than that, which is not just provide risk transfer, but actually help with risk mitigation and response, post-event response. So you're now seeing actually the cyber insurance market provide not so much a product, but a service. Yes, you've got the risk transfer there, a balance sheet which will pay you a claim in the event of a loss, but also you've got people who are helping you to make sure that you're well mitigated, because prevention is much cheaper than cure. But also you've got someone who can pull in the right resources and the right advisors to deal with an attack if you happen to be attacked. So I think the insurance industry can play an important role and needs to play an important role in helping to foster resilience. But it's a market that's quite challenged. And I just pick on really a demand side issue and a supply side issue. First of all, if you look across any Western economy, whether it's the Spanish economy, I imagine, or certainly the UK economy, sort of take-up of cyber insurance is quite low. In the UK, amongst SMEs, particularly the micro end of the SME community, we're talking about single-digit percentages of people who bought cyber insurance. So if you're using that as a rough proxy for levels of resilience, that doesn't tell a particularly good story. Why are people not buying the product? Probably value for money, cost in a cost of living crisis, but also a lack of awareness and lack of understanding of the threat. So I think there's a lot of work to be done to try and build a bigger market and make products more attractive and affordable. On the supply side, there's an issue with gaps in provision, because typically if you buy a cyber insurance product, we don't cover the stuff that we tell people to worry about. Yeah, so we typically would exclude critical national infrastructure failure or outage. So if the power grid goes down or the internet goes down, Amazon Web Services is out for 72 hours, not covered. Equally, we tend to exclude state-backed cyber attacks or cyber warfare. So the really scary stuff we tell our clients to worry about is typically the stuff we don't cover. So there's also a supply side issue as well. On the demand side, it's a lack of awareness and potential issues around affordability. And on supply, it's gaps in provision because of that fear of aggregation. Sorry, you're going to jump in, yeah.
May I ask something? Because attribution usually is very difficult, how do you know that an attack is state-backed, state-sponsored? Sure. Sorry, that was very...
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I mean, attribution is really difficult. And I think if you ask the intelligence services, they would tell you we're getting better at it. My view is just to try and cut through the whole question of attribution by focusing on the impact of a cyber event, not the driver. Yeah, so I mean, I think if you're a company and you've been hit by a cyber attack, you're probably not that fussed about who it was. You just want to get your systems back up and running and be able to trade and deal with your customers. Typically what happens is there's a big argument over who was it. Was it state-backed, or was it a terrorist organization, or was it a criminal gang? And often the intelligence services will only ever be 70% certain, and they may not want to share that intelligence for other reasons. So I think cutting through the question of attribution, which can be very long-winded and highly litigious and take years, by having a system that declares events based on their magnitude, a bit like an earthquake, right? You have a Richter scale, rather than sort of fussing about who it was. So anyway, yes, I think back to insurance, I think we have a challenge on our hands. And actually, when you're talking about these big attacks, and it's important not to catastrophize, right? These are quite remote. But if you are looking at a systemic risk event, it becomes too big almost for the private insurance market to cover. And there is a role for government to play.
Very good. Actually, Alexandra, I think that you covered the question that we all had in mind. So, Janet, so I think that we all agree in the principle of information sharing, but how do you see, why is that actually that difficult in practice?
Yeah, that's a good question. There are several reasons. One, culture, right? Some companies think that their data is their IP and it's their gem and they're not going to share it. And it's a new world. We believe that's the wrong approach. Again, companies are creating technologies and they need to walk the talk and share the data. Culture is really hard to overcome. There are some companies that refuse to share data with their competitors. And I mean, I'm hopeful over time that they'll get there. Another challenge is resources. I talk to a lot of cybersecurity vendors the world over, and economically right now it's not an easy time. And in order to share threat intelligence and make it beneficial, it has to be timely. It has to have some context around it, and you have to be able to automatically consume it. It's not going to do you any good if it's delivered in a spreadsheet, or you get this great data, but you don't have the resources to implement it into your tools. So CTA, we've built a platform that automatically shares the data to and from, but you need to have a certain level of technology within your organization. You need to be running STIX 3. So some companies, they're just not ready. They're just not there yet. And also there's legal issues. We don't have our cybersecurity members share everything. They can't. We have created an environment where you do have to share. There's no free rider, but there is data you can't share for legal reasons. Maybe there's investigations going on. Maybe it's client data that you've signed contracts that you're not going to share it. And we don't want any PII with the data we get. We don't get PII, and we don't want it, and you don't want to give it to us, right? But these challenges are all easy to overcome, and I think that we will, especially over the next couple of years. I think the economy has been hit badly, some of the vendors right now, and they're not spending. Our membership fee is very reasonable by all counts, but people are watching their money right now.
Yes, one of the challenges that always come into play when we talk about information sharing, mainly in the European Union, is about fragmentation when we go to data protection. So certain key information like IPs, address, and so on are considered data protected by the GDPR. So how, Alexandra, do you see the fragmentation we have in the regulatory environment in the European Union?
Well, if we look at cybersecurity in the financial sector, we have three sources of requirements. So you have the legislation that is dedicated to cybersecurity, like DORA that we mentioned before. You have other legislation on digital finance that has provisions on cybersecurity, like the Payment Systems Directive. And then you have a horizontal legislation on digital, like the GDPR that you mentioned, that has other requirements for cybersecurity. Now, what happens is that because banks are very heavily regulated anyway, a lot of what is provided in horizontal legislation, we already have by sector-specific legislation. So most often, horizontal requirements will overlap and repeat what we have already in place. I mentioned before the example of the CRA. Another favorite example I always use is incident reporting requirements. We have been discussing that for over 5 years. Now, depending on the incident that you have and on the type of entity that you are, when you suffer an incident in Europe, and not counting national requirements, you have to report under 6 different legislative frameworks, from the SSM framework to GDPR to PSD2, Target 2, EIDAS, NIS, you name it. And all of this happens in different templates to different authorities with different taxonomies and different timelines. Now, streamlining processes like that would really help you, banks, allocate resources to the actually tackling of the incident instead of trying to figure out where and to whom to report. So what would be a solution for that? We are advocating for better impact assessment from the cybersecurity angle when legislative proposals are being thought for digital. So first of all, try to see in advance what there is already existing in legislation and try to leverage that instead of putting new requirements all the time. Second, if you have to put new provisions, then test how this will affect the sector's capability to innovate and eventually its own cybersecurity. And the discussion around cloud security certification, which is currently happening, is a very good example. Sovereignty requirements, are they even feasible? And if they are, do they produce the right result for cybersecurity, or are we just going to create the reverse concentration risk? And then try to assess in advance the risk-benefit ratio, because sometimes it seems to me that things that we are discussing in digital finance, it's not very obvious to me whether we have high benefit for low risk or the other way around. And if I look, for example, at the general data-driven economy discussion, what I see is benefits that can come from data sharing, but at the same time, I see a continuously growing ecosystem where a lot of actors are going to be there sharing sensitive data all around, financial data, health data, government data. I'm not sure that all these actors in the ecosystem will have the same capabilities or the same culture when it comes to cybersecurity. And if I look at this with my cybersecurity hat, I feel awkward and I see an expanding attack surface. So not easy to answer it, but these are things that we should be looking at.
Very good points. I think that Janet wants to comment on that.
Yeah, I want to comment on the incident reporting requirements because, frankly, I think it's a good idea. But I think it's a very complex problem and it's going to take a long time to kind of iron it out and get it right. But I started my cybersecurity career working at a large airplane manufacturer in the Seattle area. And my job was to make sure threats didn't come into the company. And I needed to know when something was happening elsewhere, especially against my competitors, because I knew that we were a target. The problem is with the incident response reporting guidelines is the timeline. Within the first 24, even the first week, you're still really trying to iron out what happened. And there's a lot of wrong information at first. And to get that timing right is going to take a lot of effort. And also, it's kind of concerning how many reportings you have to in Europe, because who's going to see that data? What are you going to do with that data? It's out of your control. It can obviously affect stakeholder value, exactly. Right?
And it's understandable that different authorities need different information, exactly. But somehow putting everything in one template and working out the timelines, I think is very important.
Yes, actually, we have been working on discussing about having single platforms and single incident reporting. So now we are seeing multiple single reporting platforms around the globe. So it's different timelines, different templates. So, but they name themselves like single platform reporting. So and actually there is another point on incident reporting as well, is that we need, when we talk about public-private collaboration, it's not only we reporting incidents, but we need a bi-directional communication. So as you have said, actually the benefit from from an industry perspective of everybody reporting incidents is that they can be prevented in other areas of the globe or in other industries in advance. So, but we need this bilateral conversation with the public sector as well. Yeah. So, on that regard, Tom, so how do you see how private companies and governments can work together in order to mitigate the catastrophic cybersecurity risk?
Well, I think there are some compelling blueprints for how public and private sector can partner effectively together. And I run a company in the UK that's a public-private collaboration in relation to terrorism, which has been around for 30 years. There's something not completely dissimilar in Spain and other pools around the world. I should reinforce the point that a systemic cyber event is hugely remote, and it's really important not to catastrophize. The issue that most businesses are having to deal with day to day or week to week, hopefully not all the time, is ransomware and cybercrime, and that's where the focus should be. But we can't rule out a scenario in which an event affects not just multiple businesses, but virtually every business in the country at the same time, a bit like a pandemic. We're talking about a systemic risk event. And that's a nightmare scenario for all parties, particularly for the insurance industry, because I talked about aggregation of losses. It's all very well insuring a company and they have a cyber attack and you pay out. But if that's happening to every single client you've got at the same time, then it's probably going to bankrupt you. And that fear of aggregation is what leads to that restriction in supply by insurance companies. So I think we have to recognize that there is a possibility, I hope it's very remote, that you get a cyber attack and it is systemic in nature. And at that point, there's a role for government because it becomes simply too big for the private sector to manage on its own. But I think what I often say to government, I say it to people in the UK, is that for some of these systemic risk events for which the private market says, look, it's too difficult, it's too hard for us, we can't do this, they tend to exclude it. And therefore, the government becomes the largest insurance company in the country. Yeah, and it's on taxpayers. So I think if you've got a model whereby the government can provide some kind of backstop, some kind of guarantee, whether it's unlimited or limited is another question, but some kind of backstop that provides the confidence to the private market to supply a product in the knowledge that actually, if it is systemic, ultimately the government will kick in at some point. And that allows you to provide cover more easily and more affordably to all those SMEs that probably aren't currently buying the product. But it also allows you to fill in some of those gaps in the coverage that I mentioned before, which are typically excluded because of that worry about aggregation. And so we have seen in a number of countries around the world these public-private risk pools. And what you end up doing is you build a private sector buffer of capital that might be 10, 15, $20 billion before taxpayers kick in. And that's not just distancing the taxpayer from picking up the bill. It also brings into play an insurance industry which can, through risk-based pricing, incentivize good behavior and good risk mitigation because prevention is cheaper than cure. As a government, you can also charge for the backstop you provide the private insurance market with, right? So that can be a nice little money earner. And if you can build a pool, you've got a pre-funded pot of cash that's ready to go to be injected into the economy after a big systemic risk event. What we saw after COVID was governments around the world scrambling to put together schemes ex post to pump liquidity back into the economy, and that often involved a significant amount of waste and fraud. So a pre-funded pot, I think, is probably a slightly better solution. So I think it's something that the government should look at, and I think it's arguably a rational decision because otherwise they've got the risk in their laps implicitly today, and they're effectively an insurer of first resort. And I think where governments want to be is an insurer of last resort, with a thriving private sector market sitting between the taxpayer and the event.
We've been lucky that we haven't had like a WannaCry type event for a long. Those kind of events are few and far between. They're devastating when they happen, And sometimes I'm surprised we haven't seen something around it with all the conflict happening in the world right now, because it just takes a mistake in a polymorphic worm to go crazy, and we haven't seen it. Thank God. Knock on wood.
The other thing worth mentioning is that we talk about sort of cybersecurity, but it's very variable across an economy. It varies from sector to sector. I mean, you think about banking. I imagine in banking, they spend a lot of money on cybersecurity. I mean, Santander, I imagine it's best in class. But there are other aspects of critical national infrastructure. I mean, think of banking as part of CNI, but also energy, food, health, transport, education. And there will be parts of most Western economies' critical national infrastructure that are quite vulnerable to cyber attacks because the infrastructure is old and it's probably slightly degraded and needs updating. So those vulnerabilities are there. It is remote. I think it's important not to catastrophize. I can't say that enough. But I think we shouldn't allow a failure of imagination to stop us putting in place mitigants to help if and when this happens.
Preventativeness is everything, right? And those critical infrastructures are targets of the nation state actors who are, very smart and slow. And by slow, I mean they'll get into your environment and wait until the right time. So it's pretty scary.
Yes, actually, I think that they have spot on. So the operational resilience of a nation is based on the resiliency of many critical infrastructures. And this is the reason why we believe that the public-private collaboration has to be cross industries and cross sectors, not only within the financial sector, but we need to talk and to share information with the energy companies and the telecommunications, of course. So there are multiple ways in the channel and as well in the third party environment as well. So we have dependency in many of the critical infrastructure sectors on the same suppliers. So the whole ecosystem is actually needs to be secure. It's not just to be strong in one of the sectors that will ensure the resiliency of the nation.
This is also part of the discussion that we are currently having with authorized push payment fraud and what is being now on the table with the revision of PSD2. So first of all, very much to your point, Tom, you need to incentivize good behavior. So putting a flat compensation for everything doesn't give the incentive to people to be more careful with what they do online. But also, it's not up to the banks to stop fraud when it's happening in other channels before them. It's also on telecoms, it's also on social media platforms. So when we are seeing spoofed websites or spoofed phone numbers, there are also other sectors that need to take responsibility in the chain.
Yes, absolutely. So I think that this is a whole ecosystem. Security is not, we have many dependencies. We are so interconnected. So I'm talking about interconnection and complexity of environment. So I would like to know more. What is the advice that you may provide to a financial sector or a bank like us that we are in multiple locations with different jurisdictions, and how do you advise us we can manage this fragmentation?
Well, collaborate. I mean, exchange information, meaningful information and in trusted environments, but also use platforms like the EBF so as to bring together the message to policymakers and help them and support them in making less fragmented, less overlapping, more realistic, sometimes regulation. The culture of partnership between public and private, you've mentioned it already. We are all equal in the face of cyber risk, so we should collaborate not with the fear of penalties, but as equals, trying to elevate cybersecurity. Policymakers also can align better between them when they create legislation, help us streamline, help us to comply in a less complicated way. Cooperation also at the international level. So harmonizing processes and rules throughout Europe, of course, is a priority. But then, because cyber has no borders, we should see what's happening also in jurisdictions outside of Europe. And on a last point, and this would be both for the private and the public sector, we need desperately to fund actions in order to create the right digital skills and talent. We miss that. We don't have as much as we need. We need digital skills to drive innovation, to fight cybercrime, but also to do better policy making and better regulation and better supervision. So, not easy, but we need to insist on this.
We will get there. So how do you think, Janet and Tom, so that industry collaboration can actually strengthen the cybersecurity ecosystem? So Janet, maybe you want to start.
I'm going to take that in two parts. First, I'm going to talk about the ISACs and ISALs. I think, that's what they're there for, to help the individual sectors. I think the financial sector ISAC is really the most mature and the most successful. Not all of the data sharing is automated. A lot of it is still manual, and you have small banks. For an international bank like Santander, it's great, right? Because you guys have the resources, the people, the brains, the technology, but that's not clear worldwide, right? And but nonetheless, the FS-ISAC, who is a partner of CTA, by the way, is really the leading ISAC, I would say. ISACs, they have a huge role to play. I would like to see the ISAC share their data more with the cybersecurity industry. It's great they share it with themselves, but they really need to get it to us to get it into the tools so that our cybersecurity tools are going to detect it, right? Better. So you can't detect something that you don't know. I mean, sure, AI, there's some tools that can help you detect unknown, but for the most part, you really need to know what these new tactics and techniques are. So it's important that people share.
That's right.
Okay, I'll tell you about the other partnership, but I'll let Tom talk first.
Just briefly, I think if you're in the business of trying to insure against cyber risk, you've got to be able to price cyber risk. And pricing any risk entails making assumptions about frequency and severity. It's very hard to do that in the absence of data. So there are industry initiatives underway in the US, now in Europe, to share claims data. A lot of companies, when they're on the receiving end of a cyber attack, want to hush it up. But actually, if there is much more sharing of data, then we create that pool to improve cyber risk modeling. And the more we can improve cyber risk modeling, we can develop a consensus view on risk. That will bring more capital into the industry to provide more products to enable clients to hopefully to be a bit more resilient and economies to be more resilient. So all power to your elbow in terms of data sharing.
I have a real world example of that. When I was working at Boeing, I got a call one day from a cybersecurity vendor in Finland that we weren't even using. And he said, Jeanette, I want you to know that we're seeing a targeted attack against one of your competitors. He couldn't tell me a lot of details. He couldn't even tell me the competitor's name. He respected the rules. But he told me enough about the tactic that I was able to put rules in place. Now, what he didn't know, and we didn't know at the time because we didn't know who was being targeted, was that Boeing was actually working with that competitor on part of our network. Competitors do collaborate on technologies on a lot of things. And these two airline companies were working together. So had I not known about that tactic, that group that was working with Boeing could have impacted us. We could have took our network down, and that would have been millions of dollars of damage. So, competitors need to share information with each other.
Absolutely. So I will leave and open the microphones for any questions. So we can use the app, or you can just give them online. So maybe I think that you went first.
So my question is, for those of us in the room who either develop or oversee crisis management plans and seek to cover the actions internally in our organizations that should take place in the first minutes or hour of a cyber or ransomware attack, what would be the one or two crucial messages you would give us to make sure that we fully consider?
You're talking as you're trying to maintain the,
our plans to think through how we could
so developing the plans as you think. Well, they that's a hard question, not knowing your environment, right? And what sector you're from. I'm assuming financial. The one thing I think is important is to develop a plan ahead of time. I worked for one company that developed a program called it SMART, Security Monitoring and Research Technology. I forget what the T stands for. And we laid out every scenario that could possibly happen. And what do you do? Planning, anything preventative is going to help, but planning ahead with the scenarios that could possibly happen is the most important thing. So be smart about, being preventative, I guess. Yeah.
I mean, apologies, I'm not actually a cyber insurance person. I actually do terrorism, but so you might wonder why I'm sitting here. But having spoken to a CEO recently who'd been on the end of a ransomware attack, he'd been in the oil and gas industry for 30 or 40 years, and he dealt with fatalities on oil rigs. He said this was the single most stressful and difficult management experience of his entire career, and it ruined his life for X number of months. And he could focus on nothing else but just dealing with this cyber incident. And I think his advice was have really good advisors. And they had to fire a lot of their advisors because they weren't up to the job. They had lawyers who weren't good enough, crisis management firm who wasn't up to scratch. So just have really, really good advisors before the event. Was my main takeaway. And then, in terms of preventative, he talks about having a playbook. How do you run your business when the IT doesn't work? And have you practiced that? And a lot of people haven't really. They've got plans in place, but have they truly practiced how to run their organization when the IT doesn't work? A lot haven't, I suspect.
Well, and backups too, make sure you back up, but test your backups. There have been incidences where people were taken down. They went to restore the backup and they couldn't. So make sure that you have two backups, one local, one stored offsite, so that recovery can be quicker too.
Is not only is preparation and testing. So in the case of a real event, whatever, if it's a cyber event or whatever event, you cannot innovate at the moment. You cannot improvise. So it's very important that you have clear playbooks. What are the controls you can implement in order to contain the incident? So how do you need to respond? What are the different people and roles in the organization that need to play a role there? And everybody understand what they have to do during the incident. So, and testing. So rehearsing playbooks from a technical perspective, from a business perspective, and the whole organization tabletop to coordination, reporting. So there are multiple aspects that we need to coordinate in case of a cybersecurity incident. Communications, externally, communications, internal. So this is not something that you can just improvise when it happens. So preparation and testing are key.
Just one other thing. The CEO told me that when the attack happened and they tried to communicate, he said no one believed a word we said. Our network had been compromised. People thought, frankly, we were useless. And so when they tried to sort of reassure customers or speak to suppliers, etc., no one believed us. And we had to get independent advisors in there who were super credible. And they believed it when they heard it from them, but not from us. So that was interesting. I think your credibility takes a massive hit.
At the end, this is a question of trust as well. So your customers trust on you. So when you have a cybersecurity incident, you need to show them that you are doing the best to protect customers' data, customers' services. So this is their primary focus. So and this is what we need to ensure that we communicate that rightly. So, but as well, this also needs rehearsing. So it's not something that you can just, when it happens one day, decide who is the spokesperson and who is going to tell. So it's something that we need to rehearse and to be very focused on what we have to do. So I think that you have done. Thank you very much.
Okay, first shot at reacting. Couldn't agree with you more. Training and awareness raising should be continuous. And when I talked before about lack of enough digital skills and cyber skills, it's not only that we need to train people, but we also need to constantly retrain those who have already those skills, because digital and cyber evolves continuously. So it's a huge effort. And I do think that banks do a lot around this. So they try to raise awareness to their customers, they try to raise awareness to their employees. In fact, as Tom mentioned before, banking is one of the most cyber mature sectors, with the possible exception of aviation and with some distance from other sectors. So the effort is there, but it's massive. Also, very often you see that awareness raising campaigns focus on schools, children, which is great, which is fine. And schools, probably it's because it's easy to find, to go there and do it. But there are also the other segments of the population that we need to look at. Adults and senior citizens, they are vulnerable. We need more efforts there. And that's where also public-private partnership is so important, because you can't achieve scale if you don't have also the public sector involved.
Yeah, I think you can spend a lot of money on phenomenal IT and cybersecurity infrastructure, but ultimately the vulnerability is people often. I think something like 82% of cyber attacks involve some degree of human failure. So education, awareness and understanding of the threat and promoting that is, I agree, absolutely critical.
I think that Alexandra has a spot on. So it's training and awareness in different angles. I would say one is training our cybersecurity professionals. So we need to ensure that the people that work in cyber and IT mainly, they are totally upskilled. So the threat is changing so rapidly. We need to ensure that we are aware and we know how to manage the new technologies with new threats. So this is very important. So the second one is employees. So general training and awareness, how to identify phishing, how to identify malicious or potential malicious activity, social engineering, that they will call someone to try to get credentials, this type of exercising, and as well the customers and society in general. So we live in a digital life. So we need to give them, not only the customer, but the society in general, we need to give them the tools to manage and to navigate on the digital environment we live. So they need to feel that they have the power to take the right decisions when communicating with the banks with digital channels. So I don't know if there is any other question.
This is a very good question. First of all, by nature, legislation always follows. It's very difficult to do ex-ante legislation. But the Commission tried with the Digital Markets Act, for example, to put ex-ante legislation for big gatekeepers. But this is, in my view, an exception. So now, is it future-proof? I think that's why we see more and more an emphasis on result, not exactly regulating or legislating on specific technologies, but on the result that they may have and the risks that they may cause. But I would go back to what Anna Bodin said this morning about Europe having the right vision, but questioning whether we are taking the best approach to get there. And she also mentioned when she was talking about AI that we don't even understand the possibilities of AI yet. How can we legislate on it before we even understand it? I think that's always a challenge when it comes to digital. We need to put a framework, to put balance, checks and balances to protect consumers and to protect citizens. But these are very complicated issues, so we also need to put in enough time to look at all the angles before setting in a legislation. Also, an example to that end is the digital euro discussion that we are having at the moment, and that's one of the points that we are making. We need to give it enough time to look at every possible angle.
Alexandra, I think that there was another question there, right there. It was the same. Okay, so if there is not further question, so we'll close the panel here. So thank you very much, Alexandra, Tom, Janet. Always a pleasure to have you here and to listen your insightful comments. So thank you very much. And thank you very much to the audience.